a decorated war hero, once commanding nuclear submarines in the darkest corners of the world, now finds himself face down on a sunny California sidewalk, his hands cuffed, his dignity bleeding into the pavement. What crime did he commit? Taking a walk through his own neighborhood, two young officers, armed with prejudice more than reason, saw only the color of his skin. But when they finally learned who he really was, their world turned upside down. Was it fear, regret, or just damage control? You decide. Leave a comment, share your thoughts, and if this story resonates with you, consider subscribing. It means the world to us. Hands behind your head, face down, now. The voice cracked like a whip, echoing through the stillness of a late afternoon in Pacific Grove. It wasn't just an order. It carried contempt, suspicion, and a readiness to inflict pain. Then came the thud. A man's body slammed hard against the concrete. Elbows scraped, ribs jolted, breath stolen. He didn't scream. He wouldn't give them that. But inside, something fractured. The knee pressed into his back wasn't just heavy. It was symbolic. It was a message. You don't belong here. The scent of salt air and freshly trimmed hedges filled his lungs, mixing bitterly with the bite of humiliation. His cheek was ground against the warm pavement, and as the handcuffs snapped shut around his wrists, tight, punishing, he saw the shoes of curious onlookers gathering nearby. No one moved. Some filmed, a few whispered. But no one helped. He wore nothing flashy, an old Navy sweatshirt, gray joggers, and worn-out sneakers. Nothing that screamed threat. Nothing but his skin. They asked him what he was doing in this neighborhood. They accused him of watching houses, plotting crimes. Not once did they ask his name. Not once did they wonder if maybe, just maybe, he lived here. He had survived deep-sea warfare, nuclear standoffs, political chess at the highest levels. But nothing felt as crushing as the silent accusation in those young officers' eyes. And that's how it began, not in battle, but in the peaceful hush of suburbia, where an old man walked home and was taken down like a criminal. James Elroy had always found a strange kind of peace in the silence of the sea. For over 3 decades, he lived beneath the waves, commanding submarines through treacherous waters, navigating cold diplomacy in hostile territories, carrying secrets that could alter the course of history. He never asked for attention, never wanted medals, but the Pentagon kept sending them anyway. Bronze stars, Navy crosses, even a rare citation from the president himself. Still, to those who knew him, James wasn't a symbol. He was a man, disciplined, quiet, and deeply human. Now retired at 59, he had returned to what was supposed to be his sanctuary, a coastal home tucked along the winding lanes of Pacific Grove. The house wasn't grand, but it was his, modest, sun-soaked, and filled with the smell of old books and sea salt. He had chosen this place not for prestige, but for peace, to read, to garden, to walk. That afternoon, he slipped into his usual walking gear, an old Navy sweatshirt, loose gray pants, and those same New Balance sneakers he'd worn since the 90s. No rank, no insignia. Just a man stretching his legs beneath a gold November sky. The air was crisp, sweet with eucalyptus and ocean breeze, and James, for once, allowed himself to feel anonymous, just another neighbor out for a stroll. But anonymity, for a black man in a wealthy neighborhood, is rarely afforded. The peace shattered with the sudden screech of tires on asphalt. A black and white patrol SUV swerved sharply into view, halting just feet from where James stood beneath the rustling cypress trees. He stopped, startled, not alarmed, just confused. 2 officers stepped out, both young, both white, their uniforms still crisp like fresh laundry, their eyes scanning with suspicion instead of curiosity. "Sir." "Stop right there," barked the taller one, his nameplate flashing Peterson. His voice trembled with a kind of forced authority, the tone of someone eager to prove something. The other, Officer Rudd, remained silent, but his jaw was tight and his hand hovered near his belt. James paused, calm and measured, removing his earbuds. The podcast, now silenced, had been about leadership under pressure. How fitting. "Is there a problem, officers?" he asked, his voice low and respectful. "We got a report," Peterson said. "Suspicious male, loitering around the neighborhood. Might be casing houses." James blinked, unsure if he heard that right. "I'm just taking a walk. I live right down Cypress Lane," he said, pointing casually down the street. Rudd scoffed. "You live here?" That wasn't a question. It was an accusation in disguise. And James, without moving, felt something shift in the air. A chill not from the ocean breeze, but from history echoing through the present. James didn't flinch. He'd heard that tone before, on foreign soil, in foreign wars, when assumptions could cost lives. But it stung differently here. On his own street, in the country he'd defended his entire adult life. "Yes," he answered, calmly but firmly. "I've lived here for over 12 years. That house, see the one with the rust-colored shutters? That's mine." Rudd let out a soft, mocking chuckle. That's your house?" He glanced at Peterson, shaking his head. "Right. Maybe you're the landscaper, or the guy who takes the trash cans out for the real owners." James felt a slow heat rising beneath his skin. Not anger, not yet, but a quiet, pulsing tension, a reminder that even at nearly 60, in his own neighborhood in civilian clothes, he was still not allowed to just exist. "Officers," he said, leveling his voice, "I'm not sure what you believe you've seen or heard, but I've committed no crime. I'm walking home, and I'd appreciate being treated with basic respect." Peterson stepped in closer now, just enough to shrink the space between them. "Respect is earned," he muttered, his breath carrying the sharp edge of chewing gum and ego. "You don't get to question how we do our job. We're conducting an investigation, and right now you match a description." "What description is that?" James asked. Rudd replied, flat and unapologetic. "Black male, baggy clothes, hanging around where he doesn't belong." There it was. Not even veiled. James exhaled slowly, deliberately. "I'd like to see both of your badges, please." Names and numbers. That was the moment things began to shift. Small, almost imperceptible. The officers stiffened. Not because the request was out of line, it wasn't, but because they weren't used to being asked, especially not by someone like him. Peterson's nostrils flared. "You're not in a position to make demands." "I'm a citizen, and I have every right to know who's detaining me." "You're resisting," Rudd snapped. "Keep this up, and we'll take you in for obstruction." "Obstruction of what?" James asked, now with steel in his voice. The tension turned taut. Something invisible had been crossed, not by James, but by the weight of their assumptions. And though he stood still, said nothing more, his presence alone seemed to offend their sense of control. Without warning, it escalated. Officer Rudd stepped forward and shoved James square in the chest, hard enough to knock the breath from his lungs and force him backward, stumbling. He barely caught his balance before Peterson lunged, gripping his arm tightly and yanking it behind his back. "Hey!" James cried out, startled more than afraid. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Rudd didn't answer. He reached around and grabbed James's other wrist, twisting it without care. The cold click of handcuffs snapped into place, first one side, then the other. Too tight, deliberately tight. James winced as the metal dug into his skin. "You're under suspicion of trespassing," Peterson said through gritted teeth, his breath hot with adrenaline. "Keep your mouth shut." "I'm not resisting," James said calmly, though his voice shook now. Not from fear, but from the shock of how quickly dignity could be stripped away. I haven't done anything wrong. You don't tell us what's wrong, Rudd snapped. We tell you. James was shoved downward, his knees scraping the pavement as they forced him into a prone position. Rudd's knee dug into his lower back, pressing down with an unnecessary force that felt more like a message than a tactic. The pressure crushed his ribs, flattened his breath. His face was now against the sidewalk, still warm from the late-day sun, but brutal in its indifference. He tasted copper. Not from blood, not yet, but from his own restraint. You're making a big mistake, James muttered, the words muffled against the concrete. I live here. My neighbors know me, Peterson scoffed. Yeah, sure they do. A few houses down, someone had stepped out onto their porch, holding a phone in the air, recording. Another neighbor stood by her gate, frozen, clutching a dog leash in one hand and uncertainty in the other. Nobody moved closer. James had once commanded men in crisis zones, negotiated ceasefires, diffused nuclear standoffs, walked calmly through minefields. But here, on the clean streets of a quiet American town, he was helpless. Not because he was powerless, but because any move, any word out of place, could give these boys the excuse they wanted. So he lay still, not in surrender, but in defiance. A quiet resistance in the face of something far more violent than force. It was the weight of history, pressing into his spine. And it was happening all over again. The weight on his back remained, heavy and personal, like punishment for simply breathing while black. James could hear Rudd breathing hard above him, young, eager, fueled by a false sense of danger. Peterson paced a few feet away, gripping his radio, waiting for backup that was never needed. No gun had been drawn yet, but James could feel the tension inching toward that cliff. He could also feel something else now, a shift inside him. Not panic, not even rage, but clarity. Before this goes any further, he said, his voice flat, pressed into the pavement, you should probably know who I am. Rudd laughed. Actually laughed. Oh yeah? You gonna pull the I know somebody card now? No, James said. I'm telling you, I'm James Elroy. Retired Rear Admiral, United States Navy. I live at 214 Cypress Lane, half a block from where you tackled me. The laugh died. Not instantly, but enough to make the silence feel thick. Peterson stepped closer again. You expect us to believe that? I don't expect anything, James replied. But I do suggest you check your body cams, and maybe glance up at the houses around us. See those little black dots near the porch lights? Neighborhood security cameras. I helped fund that program last year. Everything you've done is on at least 3 angles. Peterson hesitated, just enough for Rudd to glance at him sideways. And I promise you, James continued, when you run my name, you'll find enough stars and bars to choke the system. You're bluffing, Rudd muttered, but his knee eased slightly off James's back. I've never bluffed in my life, James said, voice low but unmistakably firm. I didn't bluff in the Strait of Hormuz. I didn't bluff during the blackout drills in the Arctic Circle, and I'm not bluffing now. Another silence followed, tighter this time. The kind that creeps into a room when 2 people suddenly realize they've made a grave mistake, but are too afraid to say it out loud. I suggest, James said, now colder, sharper, you call your commanding officer. Tell them you've just detained Rear Admiral James Elroy, and that you'd better do it before this turns into something neither of you will recover from. Peterson stared, unsure. Rudd said nothing, but the air had shifted. Not with respect, not yet, but with fear. And James felt it, finally. Not victory, but gravity. They were beginning to understand. Less than 5 minutes later, the sirens came. Not loud and chaotic, but controlled, sharp, and deliberate. 2 squad cars and a sleek black SUV rolled down Cypress Lane with purpose. The SUV, unmarked but unmistakably official, stopped just feet from where James still lay handcuffed on the ground. The red and blue strobes from the cruisers painted the quiet neighborhood in a surreal wash of color. The tension, which had once felt private, was now suddenly public. The SUV door swung open, and a tall man in a dark suit stepped out. No uniform, but everything about him radiated authority. Following close behind was a uniformed officer, older, clearly experienced, with a look on his face that bordered on panic. The man in the suit moved quickly, bypassing the younger cops without so much as a glance. His attention was fixed solely on James. "Rear Admiral Elroy," he called, voice hoarse with shock. My God, what in the hell is going on here? It was Sheriff Thomas Lawrence, the highest-ranking law enforcement officer in Monterey County. He knelt beside James, gesturing frantically to the officer behind him. "Get those cuffs off, now!" The younger officer, Lieutenant Marquez, fumbled with his keys and released the restraints with shaking hands. James sat up slowly, rolling his stiff shoulders, his face a mask of exhaustion and restraint. Sheriff Lawrence helped him to his feet with both hands. "Sir," Lawrence said, I don't know how this happened. This is unacceptable." "It never should have—" He stopped himself. His words were failing him. James looked him directly in the eyes. "Save it," he said quietly. "You've got bigger problems right now than apologizing to me." He turned his gaze to Peterson and Rudd, both now standing at parade rest, pale as ghosts, their mouths tight and dry. James gestured toward them. "These two didn't just make a mistake. They operated on instinct, an instinct shaped by bias. If I were anyone else, I'd still be on the pavement." Lawrence turned to them, rage flaring behind his eyes. "What did you two think you were doing?" he shouted. "Do you realize who you laid hands on? You assaulted a decorated naval officer on his own street." He didn't wait for an answer. "Lieutenant, disarm them. Effective immediately. Suspend them without pay, pending investigation." The guns and badges came off. Slowly, quietly. The street had fallen into a silence heavier than any before. Something irreversible had just occurred. Sheriff Lawrence took a step back, collecting himself as the two disgraced officers stood off to the side, stripped of their authority, their eyes fixed on the ground. The tension in the air hadn't lifted, it had simply shifted. Now it belonged to the shame, the fear, and the growing awareness that this was no longer just an internal incident. It was about to become something much larger. James adjusted his sleeves, the soreness still pulsing in his shoulders. But he didn't speak right away. He let the silence stretch, commanding the moment not through rank or volume, but through presence. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm, but every word cut clean and sharp. "Sheriff Lawrence," he began, "I've spent 35 years serving this country. I've commanded submarines beneath frozen oceans, negotiated during near-conflict scenarios with hostile governments, and risked my life more times than I can count. And yet, the most humiliating, dehumanizing moment of my life happened right here. On my own street, in broad daylight, not in a war zone, but at home." The sheriff bowed his head slightly, remorse written across every crease of his face. James continued, "What I experienced wasn't just a lapse in judgment. It wasn't a miscommunication. It was a culture. A system that teaches young officers to see a black man in jogging clothes and assume the worst." Peterson shifted his weight uncomfortably. Rudd's eyes were red, though whether from anger or regret, no one could say. "I don't want platitudes," James said. "And I don't need a press release or a public relations campaign. What I want is accountability, real reform. I want to know how these officers were trained, who taught them to escalate instead of de-escalate, and why skin color still carries a silent presumption of guilt." Sheriff Lawrence nodded slowly, his voice quiet. You'll have it. Every file, every training manual, every disciplinary record. We'll open it all. Not just for me, James added, for everyone who doesn't have the benefit of rank or recognition or neighbors with cameras. Because if this can happen to me, what happens to the ones who don't get hurt at all? He wasn't shouting. He didn't need to. The weight of his words landed harder in their quiet delivery. And in that moment, the badge on Lawrence's chest felt heavier than it had ever felt before. The fallout was swift. By the next morning, both Officer Peterson and Officer Rudd were no longer wearing their uniforms. Officially suspended without pay, pending a full investigation. Their names were already making quiet waves through the ranks of Monterey County law enforcement. But it didn't stop there. The story had broken containment. A neighbor's phone footage had made its way onto the internet, first in local community forums, then national veterans groups, and by noon it had aired on 2 major networks. Rear Admiral James Elroy was not seeking attention, but attention found him. Sheriff Lawrence held a press conference that afternoon. He stood solemnly before a row of microphones outside the county courthouse and admitted the incident was a severe and unacceptable failure of judgment, training, and leadership. He confirmed an internal audit had been launched, one that would examine not just this case but broader patterns within the department, stop-and-search protocols, use of force training, and the presence or absence of racial bias education. Behind the scenes, representatives from the Department of Justice had already contacted the sheriff's office. Federal civil rights oversight was now firmly in play. A request had been made for James Elroy to participate as a civilian advisor in developing new de-escalation policies and review boards. He hadn't yet agreed, but the offer was sincere. James himself remained quiet. He declined interviews. He refused photo ops. He didn't want to be the face of a movement, only a reminder of what happens when prejudice is left unchecked. Some in the community were outraged. Others were defensive. There were arguments over whether the officers had just made an honest mistake. But even those voices couldn't erase the image of a man who had risked his life for his country being pinned to the ground on his own street. The truth had spoken. Now the question was, would anyone truly listen? A few days later, James Elroy returned to the same sidewalk where it all happened. The sunlight filtered through the cypress trees, as if nothing had changed. The cracks in the pavement were still there. So was the faint red stain from where his wrist had bled into the concrete. But something in the air felt different now. Less quiet, more watched. He didn't come for drama. He came for closure. Neighbors passed him, some nodding with silent recognition, others offering awkward smiles or words they couldn't quite find. A few even crossed the street, unsure how to face the man they had watched be handcuffed like a criminal. James said nothing. He wasn't looking for apologies. At the end of the block he paused, hands tucked into his jacket pockets. He looked out toward the ocean. The waves moved like breath, steady, relentless, unchanged by human failure. That's what he loved about the sea. It didn't judge, it didn't profile. It only responded to skill, to discipline, to respect. Later that evening, he sat alone at his kitchen table. A letter lay in front of him. It was a request from the county board to chair a new civilian oversight committee. He hadn't said yes, not yet, but he was thinking. Because change, real change, never begins in the noise. It begins in the quiet decision to not look away. Before turning off the lights, James wrote a few words on a notepad, a reminder to himself. Power is never meant to protect itself. It's meant to protect those who don't have it. Maybe that would be his answer. Maybe not. But one thing was certain. He would be watching. And the next time someone's son or daughter was stopped on the street, maybe, just maybe, it wouldn't end the same way. What would you have done in that moment? Would you speak, or would you stay silent? Let us know what you think. And if this story moved you, share it, because silence never changed anything, but stories can.